Good morning, United Methodist Men. My name is Odell Horn, North Georgia Conference President, and I want to welcome you to this conversation on identity crisis in Black theology. I want to welcome Dr. Cheryl Sanders, who is here with us. She is a professor of Christian ethics at Howard University School of Divinity, and she is also the president of the American Theological Society. Dr. Sanders has a Master's of Divinity degree and a Doctorate of Theology degree from Harvard Divinity School. And she wrote her dissertation, we'll talk a little bit about this, on the social ethics of slavery. Welcome, Dr. Sanders, to this conversation.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be a part of this conversation today. Thank you for inviting me.
Tell us what you do at Howard University School of Divinity. What is Christian ethics?
Well, Christian ethics is a field of theological study. We offer Master of Divinity, Master of Arts and Religious Studies degrees, and also we have a Doctor of Ministry degree program. And in all of our degree programs, we expect our students to do the traditional studies of Bible and theology, history, and arts of ministry. And ethics is a part of that basic foundation that we try to give our students so they can be equipped professionally and also intellectually for doing ministry, especially with an emphasis upon social justice. That's kind of our theme at Howard University. And in the ethics, Christian ethics courses, we really focus on understanding the connections between Christian faith and social justice advocacy.
Thank you. You are also a pastor, is that correct?
Yes, I'm pastor of Third Street Church of God in Washington, D.C.
Okay. And the author of several books that include the titles Living the Intersection, Empowered Ethics for a Liberated People, Ministry at the Margins, and Saints in Exile, correct?
Yes, those are my titles, my main titles, yes. And I have a forthcoming book that I'm working on, and the working title is Sanctified Social Justice.
Okay, tell me about Sanctified Social Justice.
Well, what I do in that text is to bring a particular focus on how African-American Christians in general, but especially people in the holiness and the Pentecostal tradition, have engaged the work of social justice. I talk about Black Christians as public intellectuals, and I talk about the different places of formation for this advocacy work, and also, again, the intersection of race and religion is very important in this work, and really has been a theme in all of my work. But I am, especially in my new book, attentive to, I'll call them 5 moments or trajectories in African-American religion and culture. I speak about resistance. Resistance seems to always be a starting point. If you're talking about social justice, you have to be aware of the factors and the context and the forces of oppression. So I speak about resistance. I speak also a moment of renewal. And renewal is just a name for, historically, you would call them religious awakenings, but the promptings that people are responding to think of themselves and think of their world and think of their God in a certain way that gets them engaged in the issues of their time, including evangelism and including things like prayer and worship, but also being energized for the social justice work. I speak in the book about resilience, and resilience is where we fund and build our own institutions, our churches, our families, our communities, our schools, and how that legacy sometimes gets overlooked in the zeal for participation in the structures of the dominant culture. Sometimes we are neglectful of our own. And for me, it's a both and. That you endeavor to participate in all levels of the society. But if you don't establish and build your own foundation, if you neglect the foundation of your own community, in the absence of resilience, you cannot, resistance is not sustainable. I also in the book speak about reckoning and resolution, and that is when we are empowered, when we have the resources, when we have taken a posture of resistance, how do we bring solutions? How do we bring reconciliation? I have a chapter on reconciliation in the traditional Christian term, which means how we get along, how we overcome the alienation and the enmity of the past. Because reconciliation means you're reconciled. You were once together, you separated. And the Bible has wonderful theological language about reconciliation. So that's one part of it. But what do you do when reconciliation doesn't work? When the other party is not amenable to reconciliation, then we transition to reckoning. And reckoning is not necessarily violent, but reckoning is, again, in the trajectory of Christian faith, how we push the envelope to get the kind of change so that people can flourish, because that's the goal, that our families, our communities, our individuals can flourish and not be hindered in our flourishing by the forces of racism and division and all the other things that would work against. So the economic injustice, so many fronts. But we can have one vision of human flourishing that will enable and motivate us to do all of these things that are required to sanctify our advocacy of social justice. Of course, social justice can be pursued in the absence of religion, and it can be seen as an entirely secular endeavor. But that's not the book I'm writing. I'm writing about how people of faith engage in social justice advocacy.
Amen. Amen. Hey, all right. Thank you for that. Tell me about this concept of Christian apologetics.
Yeah. Well, apologetics is the defense of the faith. We are to contend for the faith. And the Black Theology Project has an apologetic element, but I don't think the typical Black theologian sees themselves as being a Christian, a specialist in Christian apologetics. Apologetics tends to be on the conservative side. And my point is that as theologians, as theologically literate, as theologically informed people, I'm a theological educator, so that's my primary work, is to teach, inform, encourage, mentor people who are presenting themselves as wanting to be trained as theologians. We can do rhetorical advocacy, but we also need to be specifically trained to go toe to toe with the people who have taken Christian ideology in another direction. And we can't just lament the fact that, well, they believe this and they're racist or they're this. We need to engage those ideologies and ideas. See, my interest is reckoning. I believe that if I am forthright in my Christian apologetics, I can take on the people. I can dismantle the arguments that are racist and that are debilitating for my people, but not if I'm not willing to come to the table and come to the table prepared, equipped to bring rigor to the conversation. So in my new book, I talk about rigor and righteousness, borrowing language from the theologian Vincent Lloyd. He's teaches ethics and theology at Villanova. That we need to have some people who are very rigorous in our thought, in our writing, in our engagement. Again, the Christian apologists is what I would call them. But we also have a righteous dimension where we recognize that when we are speaking theologically, we are speaking to some extent on behalf of people who may not have that same language, may not have that same education, but we're nevertheless advocating with a listening ear to their concerns and their experience. So we're rigorous and righteous at the same time.
Got it. Thank you for that explanation. Let's talk about some of the things that you also are, in addition to Sanctified Social Justice, which is at the press right now, that you're working on. And let's talk about, well, before we get into it, just tell me a little bit about we'll do that later. I want you to cue it up for you later. Tell me a little bit about Howard University School of Divinity. We'll do that at the end. But let's get into our conversation on the identity crisis in Black theology. How do you see, from your perspective at Howard University School of Divinity, how do you see, first define what the identity crisis in Black theology is from your perspective?
The identity crisis in Black theology, for me, and this might sound unbelievable to you, but it is the truth. I can recall being in high school, and I always liked to read. And I remember going to a Christian bookstore in downtown Washington, D.C. That doesn't exist anymore. I mean, there's still Christian bookstores in some places, but this bookstore has been closed for many years. But just imagine, and this is back in the day when you didn't have internet, you couldn't just Google your Christian education resources. You had to go buy the book, okay? So I'm browsing in a bookstore, a Christian bookstore. And what catches my eye is a book with a bright orange cover. And the book is Black Theology and Black Power. Now I'm in high school, I'm wearing a big afro, okay? So this is in the Black Power days. And so I said, I gotta have this book. So I bought the book. I'm in high school now. I'm not a theological student. I'm in high school, but I'm just intrigued. Black Theology, Black Power. James Cohen, who is this? And it was all new. And I'm not studying theology, but I read the book. And to this day, I remember I'm reading this book. I think I understood most of it, but I was trying to figure out, why are all of this guy's footnotes from Europeans? It's all about Black Jesus, Black God, Black people, Black power, Black politics, Black. But all the footnotes in the book, virtually all of them, were Barth and Bonhoeffer and Bultmann and Tillich. And so I'm like, I was at that point learning how to create source notes and do, so I'm paying attention to the footnotes. I'm saying, so if the theology is so Black, why is it derivative from the very thing that is so white? I mean, that was just my basic logic as a 16-year-old, okay? And to me, that still names the identity crisis of Black theology. Over the years, Black theology has, of course, evolved. Dr. Cohn evolved. I mean, he wrote many books and he grew. And in fact, that was one of the critiques that he responded to in his book, God of the Oppressed, which was published maybe 6 years or so after that first book, where he was very intentional. I'm responding to my critics. I've got Black footnotes. So he was intentional about drawing on Black sources when he wrote God of the Oppressed. So he got it, right? But what I'm saying to you, I saw it right off the bat that to some extent, this Black theological discourse is framed and contained in white ideas and structures of meaning, okay? And so that's the identity crisis. It's not just you only can use Black footnotes. That's not what I'm saying. It's just that who is your audience and who are your sources and what is your vision of the things the ideas that you're putting out there. What does that look like? What does the world look like when your ideas are implemented? Is that a Black world? Is it just Black people just trying to be included? Well, that's a worthy goal. But I think we need to look beyond that. And if we're going to talk in theological terms, we must ask ourselves, what does it look like when God's plan, God's promise for our people is fulfilled? And we already know that we can't draw on the ideology of white supremacy for the answer, because white supremacy says God put us in charge. God is white. Jesus is white. We are white. We are God. That's the idolatry of white supremacy as a Christian ideology. So we got to go toe to toe against that, but we can't allow the white supremacy to continue to dictate the terms of our theological discourse. We can't allow, so what happens if we don't do that? If we let that happen, then when the white discourse shifts, we shift with it. When whites begin to introduce other kinds of ethical ideas, and we embrace those. And I'm not saying reject it because it's white. I'm just saying identity crisis is our failure to consistently set our own agenda. An agenda is important.
So let me ask you, thank you for that. Thank you. And when you're talking about Cone, and he's writing this book, Black Theology and Black Power, he's using sources that are white, but you mentioned Barth, Bonhoeffer, Tillich, Bultmann. These are all 19th and 20th century German sources, correct?
For the most part.
So when he writes God of the Oppressed, he's using Black sources. Who are the Black sources and what centuries are these Black sources?
Well, I can't give you a precise answer because I haven't looked at the text, the God of the Oppressed, but basically he's drawing on Black culture and Black theologians in general doing this over time. As I said, the evolution, using slave sources. You're not using Black theological sources per se because you're creating Black theology, okay? So it's not like, well, where's the Black Barth and the Black Bonhoeffer? It's not that. Some of our Black theologians have acknowledged the African origins of the early church fathers like Augustine and Origen, and say, oh, well, in the patristic period, we had Africans who are doing theology, but some of us haven't done that historical work. So I'm not saying that there are no Black theological sources. I'm just saying the evolution of Black theology begins with basically it's a protest, which it should be. It should be a protest, but the protest originally, what I'm suggesting, if you follow my line of argument, the protest originates with a man like James Cone trying to find his way as a theologian in a dominantly white environment. And so it's the language of protest and insisting, I can master the same thing that you can master. And so what I'm saying is, to this day, if you're an African American and you are doing advanced doctoral studies, PhD studies in theology or any other field for that matter, you're getting that degree in a predominantly white institution, because there are no Black institutions that grant that degree in the field of religion and theology, okay? So what that means is the politics of doing a dissertation, you have to respond to the requirements of your mentoring environment, okay? Now, I'm not saying that they're necessarily racist, but they're not, that's not going to be a Black environment. And so to some extent, we all have to find our identity as we're mastering a discourse that's beyond our group, okay? That is bigger than our group. And at worst, a discourse that's hostile and inimical to our flourishing and even to our being included. Okay, so that hasn't changed. I'm not arguing against the protests of Dr. Cone. I'm simply saying that at the beginning, there wasn't the attention to Black sources that evolved, but it was almost like, oh, I got to do Black sources. Like, and similar, he had women, a few Black women students who said, wait a minute, this Black power thing is all very masculinist. What about women? What about women's concern? What about feminism? And then, so it's like, oh, okay, let me respond to the feminists. So there's evolution and growth there, but you might ask the question, well, why didn't you include women from the beginning? Because that wasn't the focus. You include women when the women insist on it, okay? But you still have, I saw posted on social media this week, a selfie that a professor at one of the Southern Baptist seminaries took of himself for the first time having a class with women in it. I'm not talking about 100 years ago, I'm talking about this week. And the women, and the classroom was full of women, and he was like, oh, I'm teaching women. He asked if he could teach women because he's in a church and in a theological school that doesn't believe that men and women are equal. I mean, this is in the year 2022. And so then you want to ask, well, what kind of women would want to sit in his classroom and be taught about their inferiority in the year 2022? So, so the idea of growing, and hopefully this professor will grow if he's so proud of himself for finally teaching women, maybe he'll learn something from the women. Who knows? I hope. But it's just kind of mind-boggling that even in this century, we haven't figured out that men and women are equal. And the ongoing quest, of course, is to figure out how do we bring equality and freedom and inclusivity to broader populations of people who are going to make claims. Black theology has been very good about evolving to be inclusive, particularly of the on the progressive liberal side, inclusive in terms of gender, in terms of LGBTQ. That includes the Black theology has been on cutting edge of that. But one of the things the Black theologians have struggled with is how to stay connected, or whether to stay connected at all, to the Black church. So what you have then as part of that identity crisis is an alienation from the Black church. The white theologians could care less about the Black church. Black church doesn't even exist as far as they're concerned. They have no accountability to the Black church. But what's a Black theologian going to do without an accountability to the Black church? And that's a question that Black theologians have wrestled with for 50 years and still hadn't been resolved. But we need theologians, the church needs theologians, but we need theologians who understand and embrace us rather than to fight and condemn us. I'm saying in the church.
So I'm going to come back to that, but let me ask you a question related to, thank you for the explanation. Cecil Cone introduces this conversation or this topic of identity crisis in Black theology. What was Cecil Cone's argument, as you understand it?
Well, my understanding of Cecil Cone's argument was exactly what I just said about the importance of the Black church and the Black sources. And he's, of course, the brother of James Cone. And as far as I know, his one book on the identity crisis was like he did one book. He did not have nearly the visibility or the prominence of James Cone. But his argument was for Black religion, Black sources, Black church having a bigger role in Black theology, essentially. And I believe he's absolutely correct. But I think that discourse still continues because, see, what can happen is that the theologian who becomes completely alienated from the church, it's not helpful to us. That theological discourse, when I spoke a moment about the rigor and the righteousness, we should be knowledgeable of who the theologians are in the church. And I think there's a mutual alienation. I think that the Black theologians will always learn to what? The church doesn't, the Black church is homophobic, for instance. The Black church, they're always condemning the Black church. But my question is, well, what positive thing did you have to offer to the Black church other than condemnation? Okay. And so Dr. Cone, James, in his autobiography, which was published a few short months after his death, but thank God he was able to finish it, but it didn't appear in print until a few months later, said I wasn't going to tell nobody. When I read his autobiography, I understood some of the reason why Black theology has not resolved this identity crisis. And that is, Dr. Cone, if you ever read anything that he's written, he always uses as his benchmark for the Black church his experience as a child growing up in Arkansas. And he attended an AME church in Arkansas. What I didn't really figure out until I read the autobiography is that when he left Arkansas, he left the Black church. And so his point of reference for the Black church remains his childhood. But as far as having an ongoing, I think he became disillusioned with the Black church. Now, he didn't let up on his critique, but it's one thing to be critical from the outside. It's another thing to have a vested interest in the well-being from the inside. And so I'm not saying that he didn't have a right to leave the church. I'm just saying that if he's the one who set the tone for how Black theology is done, that alienation remains unresolved. So at least some of us, and Dr. James Cone told me himself that it's impossible to maintain a footing in the academy and the church. He told me that. And I told him I beg to differ. Now, I'm not saying it's an easy road to be a pastor and a theology professor, but I'm not going to give up on the church. I don't have to be a pastor, but I'm not going to give up on the church. I'm going to be that's who I am. Okay. And so I'm going to bring Bible. The great commandment is you love God with all your mind and all your strength and all of your being. Right. And so the mind, the intellect, the intellectual discourse, as far as I'm concerned, that public witness of the Christian intellectual is a vocation that I want to exemplify and I want to promote. Everybody doesn't have to be a Christian. Every theologian doesn't have to believe God, but some of us do. And if we do, and if we're engaging and generating conversations and educational materials, this is one reason why I so much appreciate Dr. James D. Otis Roberts, There's an upcoming event that's being planned to honor him at Duke Divinity School in the fall. But Dr. Deotis Roberts was always forthright about religious education, making sure that what the theologians are producing and writing and saying is engaging the issues of people in churches.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's go a little bit further in this conversation. You had a question about liberation theology, and so I want to ask that question. I want you to give me your answer. Once you've been liberated, what are you going to do? First of all, why do you ask that question, and then tell me your answer to that question.
My answer to that question is my book, Empowerment Ethics for Liberated People. And I did that book in 1995. And what I did in that text was to give my positive, constructive critique of Black theology. That's precisely the question I asked. And I'll tell you where the question came from. Two places. I had been asked to give a lecture at Harvard back in the 90s. And the people who invited me to lecture wasn't the faculty, but it was a student or alumni group at Harvard. And they said, well, we want you to come and talk about empowerment. It's a funny thing. Sometimes people ask you to give a lecture and they tell you exactly what they want you to say. And it was like, we want you to talk about empowerment. So I said, okay, I'll talk about empowerment. And I did that lecture. I talked about empowerment, my idea of empowerment over against liberation. You're liberated to be set free. Empowerment is when you start doing your own stuff and making your own decisions. So I did that lecture, and that was sort of like foundational for my book. But then I also had a student at the time. I was teaching at Howard, and I had a student who was an elected state's attorney for the state of Maryland. So that's a big job, big position. And one day he came to me and he said, I'm studying about liberation. He says, but all of the Black theologians talk about making a claim to be free of oppression. He said, I make all of the decisions. I make the hiring decision. I make the firing decision. Where is the theology? Where's the ethics for people who are in charge of their own institutions? So I was intrigued by the question. That's what I'm saying. I'm hoping that white professor down there in Kentucky will figure out when he's teaching these women that the women have something to teach him. I hope he'll figure that out. And that those women, that at least one of them will have the courage to challenge him on that complementarity and all of that kind of stuff. I hope they'll challenge him. But my experience is my student challenged you, and it was more of a one. He said, I don't get this. Where's the ethics for the people who run their own stuff? So that's, to me, the answer. The liberation theology, to a great extent, not entirely, but to a great extent, is a conversation of people in a minority position trying to make claims of people they perceive as having power over them. So when I wrote the Empowerment Ethics book, I was real clear. Look, I live in, well, at least at the time, a predominantly Black city. The mayor's Black. Everybody writes my paycheck is Black. The bank where I go is Black. I mean, I live in a Black environment, right? And so I don't spend my time in theological discourse or other discourse trying to figure out how do I get white people to do this or do that. I'm not saying that there's no racism, that there's no white presence or white, but it's that's not. I'm not constantly making claims about white people this and white people that. Make those claims when they're necessary. See, I'll go back to my thing, what I started, spoke about resilience. You're not going to be empowered until you invest in the resilience of your own institutions. That's the point of liberation. so that you can be free from somebody else's agenda and create your own. That's empowerment. And I think we're still doing it. And some of us are so sold into, we still longing for the luxuries of Egypt. One of the complaints that the people made to Moses, why did you bring us out here to the wilderness? We had wonderful food in Egypt. We loved Egypt, okay? And they were convincing themselves they wanted to go back. So what happens when some people, well, look at Joseph. I mean, Joseph rose to power in Egypt. So, you know, his Egyptian empowerment was magnificent. But Joseph's trajectory is not the trajectory of all the people. They ain't gonna put everybody in charge. But how do you develop leadership and institutions and agenda and strategy for your own people to flourish? Because I remind you, if you read the book of Exodus, the beginning of the oppression was the flourishing of the people. And the Egyptians said, oh, wait a minute, these Hebrews, it's too many of them. And they started the genocide and the slavery. What triggered it? The flourishing. And so how do we recover the right, the space, the desire, the motivation to flourish? You don't flourish at the expense of others, but to flourish because that's the agenda that God has given us. That's empowerment.
Thank you for that. Let's briefly talk about the identity crisis in the Black Christian public intellectual. There seems to be some folk who are Stony the Road We Trod by King Hope Felder. There's one part of the book that talks about the fourth reading of the Bible in the 20th century was an esoteric and elitist hermeneutic. There were folk who had been trained in historical criticism, and they brought that to the church. And some of us rejected that. But talk to me about this identity crisis in Black Christian public intellectuals.
Well, first of all, I don't think we have enough of them. People who are public intellectuals, we don't have a lot. And perhaps the most important Christian public intellectual of the previous century would have been Martin Luther King Jr. Okay. And he's important as a public intellectual, even though the fact that he was trained and certified as a systematic theologian, it gets lost on people. I mean, it's like, well, yeah, he was Dr. King, but he was trained as a theologian, but he was a theologian who took his advocacy to the church and to the society. So he was not an ivory tower intellectual. He always had the option to be a pastor. You know, he was a pastor in Montgomery, but he didn't last too long as a pastor, because his pastor was beyond one congregation. He had experience teaching in the classroom, but his classroom was beyond one space or one institution. But Dr. King was most important Christian intellectual of our time, because he brought his theology, his ideas, his advocacy to the broadest stage imaginable. And he used the media and he used those opportunities to make his case as a theologically informed public intellectual. And we are still basking in the glory of his discourse. We are still feeling the sting of his tragic assassination, but we remind ourselves periodically of the dream, of the vision, of the critique. In our own century, we have public intellectuals. Among them is Cornel West, Michael Eric Dyson, just to name a couple, But they are not, they are intellectuals who've done a lot of writing, even Skip Gates, I would put in that category, intellectuals who have made an impact. But I would like to see more investment in mentoring a generation, not just individuals, but a generation, bringing that mindset to our institutions and classrooms so that we have communities of people who are theologically informed, they're ethically focused, and they understand the agenda and the advocacy, how to communicate that to broad audiences, because that's what a public intellectual does. Public intellectual has a broad audience. How do you cultivate that broader audience? In the age of social media, as they say, the sky's the limit. And we have people who in our community who long to be influencers, but who's being an influencer for the flourishing of our people. That's the agenda, I believe, of the Black Christian public intellectual going forward. To be influencer for the advancement of the kingdom of God in God's people. That's the opportunity that's before us now.
We've been talking, thank you. We've been talking to Dr. Cheryl Sanders. She is a professor of Christian ethics at Howard University School of Divinity, and she's been talking on the topic of identity crisis in Black theology. And I want you, thank you for this conversation, but Dr. Sanders, I want you to tell people about Howard University School of Divinity, and if they're considering going to a seminary, what's how Howard University School of Divinity can help them.
Thanks for asking. Howard University School of Divinity is a part of Howard University, historic Howard University, the capstone of Black education, higher education. We're very pleased to have more than 150 years of history at Howard. Howard is a place where you can come and do a Master of Divinity degree, Master of Arts and Religious Studies, a Doctor of Ministry degree. So we equip people for ministry in church and community. We equip people for study of biblical hermeneutics, theology, we have wonderful classes in Black theology and ethics. We have all of the arts of ministry classes and opportunities. We have ethics and social justice is a major emphasis at our school. In fact, we currently have a program. I'm not exactly sure if the window of opportunity is still there, but you can check our website that we have some special initiatives underway, which include scholarships and funding for people who are interested in ethical leadership, social justice advocacy. Our dean is Yolanda Pierce, and Dean Pierce is a very astute public intellectual, Christian public intellectual, who is a leader in many quarters, but before she came to Howard, she was in charge of a Black theology initiative at Princeton Theological Seminary. And we're very thankful for her theological work. She has a book that she published a few months ago, drawing on the narratives of her upbringing and her grandmother to do womanist, it's a womanist theological text. And so Howard is a place where we have outstanding students, outstanding faculty. We're related to a Black university that has all the professional schools. And we're in the nation's capital. So Howard would be a great place. And we encourage any of you who are watching this to go to our website. You can find us at howard.edu. I think it's divinity.howard.edu, and you will see what we have to offer and why I'm so excited about the possibility of inviting others to join us.
Thank you. I also get this as an opportunity at Howard. This is a place where you can have an open conversation about the identity crisis in
Oh,
Black theology.
absolutely. Every day. Yes, we have lectures and classes that address these issues day in and day out. And we're very thankful for the opportunity that we have. As I mentioned earlier, everybody who does advanced theological study, they're not places where you can study these questions in a predominantly African American environment. But we are that kind of space. And it's not exclusively Black, because exclusion is not what it's about. It's about a focus on nurturing a community that is aware and resistant to the forces of anti-Blackness. We're aware of that. You don't have to convince us that there's anti-Blackness in the society. We try to be a healing, reconciling community. And so we welcome people to come and share what we have to offer. It's a great place to be.
Thank you for that. I want to echo, it is not a place of exclusion. I went to Bethel Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota for a year, and Curtis DeYoung was hired by Bethel Seminary, and we got in a conversation, and he is a white male, and he told me he did his Master's of Divinity degree, I believe it was, at Howard University School of Divinity. I was like, what?
Yes, he did. In fact, he was a member of the church where I'm now pastor. So he had an immersion experience in African American religious culture when he was at Howard.
Amen. Amen. So it is not a place of exclusion. Everybody's welcome. Thank you, Dr. Sanders, for this conversation.
Thanks for having me.